In 1967, a small company in rural Iowa sold Americans something they had never seen inside a kitchen before. An oven with no flame, no heating coil, no fire of any kind. Just invisible waves moving through food at the speed of light. It weighed 60 pounds. It cost $495. And the first time most people watched it work, they genuinely believed they were watching magic. By the mid-1970s, the Amana Radarange sat on the kitchen counters of millions of American homes. The name Radarange meant microwave oven the same way Kleenex meant tissue. Amana had not just sold a product, it had rewired the American kitchen, changed the way a nation ate, and put the future within arm's reach of any family that could afford it. Then it was sold, and sold again, and sold one more time after that, until the name that had once meant the future was just a sticker on someone else's budget appliance. How does the company that brought the microwave oven into the American home end up forgotten in that very same kitchen? The story does not begin in a laboratory. It does not begin in Silicon Valley or a university research center or a corporate headquarters with glass walls and a cafeteria. It begins in a place most Americans have never heard of, a small, quiet settlement in the rolling farmland of eastern Iowa called Middle Amana, where the roads are narrow, the winters are long, and the people have always believed that if something is worth doing, it is worth doing with your hands and doing it right. The Amana colonies were unlike anywhere else in America. Founded in the 1850s by a German religious sect called the Community of True Inspiration, the 7 villages that made up the colonies operated as a communal society for nearly a century, growing their own food, making their own furniture, running their own mills, their own bakeries, their own woolen factories. These were people who did not believe in waste. They did not believe in shortcuts. They believed that the quality of the work reflected the character of the worker. That philosophy would outlast the communal society itself, and it would eventually travel from Iowa into the kitchens of the entire country. George Forstner was not a visionary in the way that word gets used today. He was not building a platform or disrupting an industry. He was a practical man solving a practical problem. In 1934, the Amana colonies had just voted to end their communal economic structure, a decision driven by the crushing pressure of the Great Depression, and reorganize as a for-profit corporation. Forstner, a young man with a background in refrigeration mechanics, saw an opportunity. Restaurants and hotels across the Midwest needed reliable commercial freezers. The equipment available at the time was expensive, inconsistent, and difficult to maintain. Forstner believed he could build something better. He founded the electrical equipment company in Middle Amana that same year. The operation was modest, a small workforce, a modest facility, the kind of enterprise that ran on reputation rather than advertising. But the freezers Forstner's team built were dependable. Chefs and hotel operators trusted them. Word moved through the industry the way word moves in tight-knit professional communities, slowly then all at once. By the time World War II began, the electrical equipment company had earned enough of a reputation that the shift to wartime production came naturally. The company retooled, as so many American manufacturers did, and spent the war years building equipment for military use. Those years mattered more than they might appear to. Working alongside wartime technology meant working at the edge of what American engineering could do. The men who came back to the factory floor in 1945 were not the same men who had left it. They had seen what precision manufacturing looked like when the stakes were as high as they could possibly be. In 1947, Forstner made a decision that would define the company's legacy. He introduced one of the first upright home refrigerators available to American consumers at a price that an ordinary working family could consider. The refrigerator market until that point had been dominated by cumbersome, expensive units that required professional installation and ongoing maintenance. Forstner's model was different, straightforward, solidly built, and priced to sell to the same middle American families who lived in towns not unlike the one where it was made. The company changed its name to Amana Refrigeration that same year, taking the name of the colonies where it was born. It was a deliberate choice. The name carried meaning. It meant something about where this company came from and what it stood for. A place that had been building useful, honest things for 100 years, before anyone outside Iowa knew it existed. The first refrigerators left the Amana factory on flatbed trucks, rolling out past fields of corn and soybean under a wide Iowa sky. They traveled to hardware stores and appliance dealers in cities and small towns across the Midwest: Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Davenport, Chicago, Minneapolis. Families who had never owned a proper refrigerator, who had relied on ice boxes and root cellars in the cold of a Midwestern winter, now had something permanent and reliable humming quietly in their kitchens. George Forstner did not talk about changing the world. He talked about building something that worked, that lasted, and that an ordinary person could afford. In a country that was pulling itself out of depression and war and beginning to imagine what peacetime prosperity might look like, that was exactly the right thing to be saying. What Forstner could not have known in 1947 was that the technology that would make Amana famous across the entire world had already been discovered, by accident, in a laboratory 1,500 miles away. And it had nothing to do with refrigeration. It had everything to do with radar. In August of 1945, a Raytheon engineer named Percy Spencer was walking through a laboratory in Waltham, Massachusetts, when he noticed something strange. Spencer was working on magnetron tubes, the core component of radar technology that had helped Allied forces track enemy aircraft during the war. He walked in front of an active magnetron, reached into his pocket, and found that the chocolate peanut butter bar he had been carrying had melted. Not from body heat, not from the afternoon sun, from the invisible microwave energy radiating out of the equipment in front of him. Spencer was the kind of engineer who did not walk away from an unexpected result. He ran experiments. He pointed the magnetron at popcorn kernels and watched them pop. He pointed it at an egg, which exploded. He understood almost immediately what he was looking at: a heat source with no flame, no element, no direct contact of any kind. Energy moving through food at the molecular level. He brought the idea to Raytheon's leadership, and by 1947, the company had built the first commercial microwave oven. It stood nearly 6 feet tall. It weighed 750 pounds. It cost $5,000 and required a dedicated water cooling system to operate. Raytheon sold it to restaurants, hospital cafeterias, and naval vessels, anywhere that needed to heat large quantities of food at high speed. It was impressive technology in an impressive machine. It was also completely impractical for the place where most Americans actually ate their meals. That gap in between what the technology could do and where it needed to go is exactly what brought Raytheon to the door of a refrigerator company in Iowa. In 1965, Raytheon acquired Amana Refrigeration. The purchase was strategic. Raytheon had the technology. Amana had the manufacturing infrastructure, the distribution network, the retail relationships, and 20 years of earned trust with the American consumer. The plan was straightforward. Take the magnetron out of the industrial kitchen and put it on the household countertop. Shrink it, simplify it, price it for the family that bought its refrigerator at Sears. It took 2 years. In 1967, Amana introduced the Radarange, the first microwave oven designed and priced for the American home. It cost $495, which was serious money in 1967, the equivalent of roughly $4,000 today. It weighed 60 pounds. It sat on the countertop like a small television set, with a dark glass door and a simple dial timer. There was nothing sleek about it, nothing minimalist. It was a substantial, purposeful machine that announced its own presence in a room. The reaction when people first saw it work was not polite interest. It was something closer to disbelief. Department store demonstrations drew crowds. A Raytheon sales representative would place a frozen piece of meat in front of the magnetron, set the timer, and stand back while an audience of housewives and curious husbands watched something that contradicted everything they knew about cooking. Heat required fire. Heat required time. Heat required standing at the stove and watching and waiting. The Radarange rewrote those rules in front of their eyes, and the people who witnessed it did not forget it. What does it feel like to hold the future in your kitchen? For a generation of American families, that question had a specific answer. It felt like watching a baked potato cook in 5 minutes. It felt like reheating last night's dinner in 30 seconds. It smelled like warm plastic and circulating air, and something faintly electric that nobody could quite identify, but everyone came to associate with modern life. The Radarange did not just change how people cooked. It changed how people thought about time in the kitchen, and by extension, how they thought about time itself. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the Radarange spread through American homes the way color television had spread a decade before, first as a luxury, then as an aspiration, then as a standard. Amana's marketing leaned into the technology without mystifying it. Print advertisements showed the Radarange on clean countertops in bright kitchens, positioned not as a scientific curiosity, but as a practical tool for the modern American family. The copy was direct: save time, eat better, live easier. The message landed because it was true. By the early 1970s, Amana had expanded the Radarange line and was selling through major retail chains, including Sears, Montgomery Ward, and independent appliance dealers across the country. The price was coming down, slowly, year by year, as manufacturing improved and volume increased. More families could reach it. More families did. Inside the communities and neighborhoods where the Radarange arrived, its introduction became a small domestic event. Families gathered around the first demonstration. Children were warned not to stand too close. There were rumors about radiation, about microwaves being dangerous, about eyes and pacemakers and inexplicable risks that nobody could fully explain, but everybody repeated with authority. Most families ignored the warnings after the first week and simply used the machine. It worked. The food was hot, nothing exploded. Life moved faster and dinner came easier. And that, for most American families in 1972, was enough. The employees at the Amana plant in Iowa felt it too. The facility had expanded significantly since Raytheon's acquisition, bringing new jobs to a community that had operated on the quiet rhythms of colony life for over a century. Workers on the factory floor were building something that they saw on television, that their neighbors talked about, that magazines wrote about as if it were the beginning of a new era. There was a pride in that which went beyond a paycheck. A woman who worked on the assembly line in Amana during those years later recalled that her father, a farmer, had once asked her what she made at the plant. She told him she made the future. He thought she was joking. She was not. What was it about that era that made everything Amana touched feel like it mattered? Part of it was timing. The post-war boom had given American families money to spend and optimism to spend it with. In the 1970s, for all their turmoil, still carried the belief that technology was on the side of the ordinary person. Part of it was geography. There was something about the fact that this product came from Iowa, from a place that smelled like rain and corn and honest work, that made it feel trustworthy in a way that a product from a distant city might not have. And part of it was simply the product itself, which did exactly what it promised every single time in millions of homes across the country. By the late 1970s, the Amana Radarange had become one of the most recognized appliance names in the United States. It had appeared in national magazines, in television advertisements, in newspaper lifestyle sections, and in the kitchens of American presidents. It had crossed every regional and demographic line the country contained. It was in farmhouses in Nebraska, and apartments in New York, and split levels in suburban Atlanta. The name Radarange had done what very few product names ever managed to do. It had become the word people used for the thing itself, regardless of who made it. That is a rare kind of success, and like all rare things, it would not last forever. Success in American business has a way of demanding more of itself. A product that sells well must sell better. A company that grows must grow faster. A brand that earns trust in one category must earn it in 5. These are not laws of nature. They are choices. Choices made by people in rooms far from the factory floor, people who look at a chart trending upward and feel, with absolute certainty, that the only responsible thing to do is push it higher. For Amana, the decision to expand beyond the Radarange was made with the best of intentions. It was also the first step toward losing everything that made the company worth expanding in the first place. Through the early 1970s, Amana's product line had already grown beyond refrigerators and microwave ovens. The company manufactured window air conditioners, chest freezers, and a range of kitchen appliances that carried the same name and the same implied promise of quality. Raytheon, as the parent company, was supportive of growth. A diversified product line meant more revenue streams, more retail shelf space, and a stronger negotiating position with the large national chains that were increasingly controlling what American consumers could actually buy. The logic was sound. The execution was confident. And the results through most of the 1970s were genuinely impressive. The price of the Radarange dropped steadily across the decade, from $495 in 1967 to around $300 by the mid-1970s to under $200 by the early 1980s. Each price reduction opened the product to a new tier of the American market. Families who had watched their neighbors buy a Radarange and waited, saving, calculating whether it was worth it, now found themselves standing in a Sears appliance department holding a box they could actually afford. The market grew not because Amana invented new customers, but because Amana made itself reachable to the customers who had always been there. By 1975, Americans were buying more than 1 million microwave ovens per year. Amana was the name most associated with the category, not because it was the only manufacturer, but because it had been first, and in consumer technology, being first creates an association that competitors spend years and fortunes trying to break. General Electric had entered the market. Litton Industries was selling microwaves. Sharp and Panasonic, both Japanese manufacturers, were beginning to move product into American retail channels at price points that reflected the lower labor costs of overseas production. The competition was real, and it was coming from multiple directions at once. Raytheon's response was to accelerate. More models, more features, more retail partners. The Radarange line expanded to include countertop units at several price points, over-the-range models designed to replace the kitchen hood above the stove, and combination units that paired microwave technology with conventional heating elements. Each new product was a reasonable answer to a real market demand. Each new product also required engineering resources, quality control infrastructure, and marketing attention that had to come from somewhere. And increasingly, that somewhere was the same pool of talent and capital that had made the original Radarange exceptional. There is a pattern in American manufacturing history that repeats with enough consistency to qualify as a law. A company builds one great thing. The great thing succeeds. The company uses the reputation of the great thing to sell more things. The more things dilute the reputation. The reputation, once diluted, cannot easily be restored. Amana had not reached that point yet in 1975 or even in 1980, but the mechanism was already in motion, visible in hindsight, even if it was invisible at the time to the people running the company. What the expansion years looked like from the outside was pure success. Amana products were on the shelves of every major appliance retailer in the country. The brand name moved through American culture with the easy confidence of something that had earned its place. Television commercials showed Amana refrigerators, Amana air conditioners, Amana microwaves. A full household solution from a name that families already trusted. The advertising was clean and direct, the kind of Midwestern straightforwardness that had characterized the company since George Forstner built his first commercial freezer in 1934. What the expansion years looked like from the inside was more complicated. Engineers who had joined Amana because of the Radarange's technical ambition found themselves working on products that were less interesting and less differentiated. Appliances that needed to be competitive on price above all else, which meant that the margins available for genuine innovation were shrinking with every product cycle. The culture of precision and pride that had defined the Amana colonies for a century was still present, still felt, still talked about in the break rooms and on the factory floor. But culture, like capital, can be spent, and Amana was spending it faster than it was being replenished. Meanwhile, the competitive landscape was changing in ways that no amount of product line expansion could address. Japanese manufacturers had spent the 1970s studying American consumer electronics markets with methodical intensity, and by the early 1980s, they were producing microwave ovens that matched Amana's quality at prices that undercut Amana's margins. Sharp's microwave division, in particular, was building a reputation for reliability and value that spoke directly to the same middle American consumer that Amana had always served. The difference was that Sharp could manufacture in Japan at a cost that Amana, making its products in Iowa, simply could not match. The retail chains noticed. Sears began stocking more competitive models alongside Amana. Montgomery Ward gave more floor space to Japanese brands. The independent appliance dealers who had built their businesses on Amana's reputation began hedging, carrying more brands, giving customers more options. None of this was a crisis in 1982 or 1983. It was the kind of slow, structural shift that looks manageable from quarter to quarter and only reveals its true scale when you step back and look at 5 years at once. The peak was near. Everyone inside the company could feel it, even if nobody said it out loud. When a brand is truly at its height, there is a particular kind of confidence in the air, a sense that the name alone is enough, that customers will find their way to the product without being chased, that the work of building the reputation is largely done. That confidence is not wrong exactly, it's just late. By the time a company feels that certain of itself, the conditions that created the certainty have usually already begun to change. There is a moment in the life of certain American brands when they cross a line that cannot be precisely located, but can be absolutely felt. It is the moment when the brand stops being a product and becomes a reference point. When people stop saying they own one and start saying they grew up with one. When the name moves out of the store and into the language itself, into the way families talk about their kitchens, their routines, their memories of what home felt like on an ordinary Tuesday evening in 1978. Amana crossed that line sometime in the mid-1970s, and for roughly a decade it stayed on the other side of it, occupying a place in American domestic life that very few companies ever reach and almost none manage to hold. By 1980, an estimated 1 in 4 American households owned a microwave oven. By 1986, that number had climbed past 60%. The growth curve was one of the steepest in the history of American consumer appliances, faster than the adoption of the color television, faster than the dishwasher, faster than the clothes dryer. And while Amana was no longer the only manufacturer in the market, it remained the name that Americans reached for first when they thought about the category. Surveys of brand recognition conducted through the early 1980s placed the Radarange name at the top of microwave awareness in the United States. Not just among people who owned an Amana, but among people who owned any microwave at all. The product had defined the category so thoroughly that the category borrowed its identity. What made that kind of cultural saturation possible was not advertising alone. Though Amana spent heavily on television through the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was the product's integration into the daily rhythms of American family life in ways that were practical, immediate, and impossible to give up once experienced. The Radarange changed the architecture of the American evening. Dinner no longer required 2 hours of preparation. Leftovers became a legitimate meal option rather than an apology. Children old enough to operate a dial could heat their own food after school without adult supervision. Working mothers, whose numbers were growing rapidly through this period, found in the microwave oven a genuine redistribution of the domestic burden. Not a solution to every problem, but a real and daily relief from one of the most time-consuming. The Today Show ran a segment in 1983 that captured the moment precisely. A host demonstrated the Radarange to a studio audience, heating a cup of coffee and a plate of leftovers while explaining, with the mild amazement that characterized television's relationship with consumer technology in that era, that this machine had already found its way into the majority of American kitchens. The audience applauded as if something had been confirmed rather than demonstrated. They already knew. They were applauding recognition. What did it feel like to work at Amana during those years? The plant in Amana, Iowa was running at full capacity through most of the late 1970s and early 1980s. 3 shifts, hundreds of workers, the kind of sustained employment that anchors a small community in ways that go far beyond the paycheck. The tax base, the local businesses, the sense of collective purpose that comes from knowing that what you make every day is wanted, is used, is present in the homes of people across the entire country. Workers who spent their careers at the Amana plant during those years described the atmosphere in terms that sound less like a factory and more like a community institution. There was pride in the product. There was pride in the name. There was a feeling not always articulated, but consistently present that building an Amana appliance meant participating in something larger than the individual shift or the individual paycheck. The generational reach of the brand during its peak years was something that few companies manage and none can manufacture deliberately. The silent generation, Americans born in the 1920s and 1930s, had bought the first Radaranges in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the price was still substantial and the technology still genuinely novel. Their children, the baby boomers, had grown up watching the Radarange in their parents' kitchens, had absorbed it as a fixture of domestic life, and by the late 1970s and early 1980s were buying their own homes and furnishing their own kitchens. For a significant portion of that generation, buying an Amana was not a decision that required research or deliberation. It was a continuation. It was what you bought because it was what your family had. And your family had it because it worked. And it worked because it was Amana. That cycle of inherited trust is the most valuable thing a consumer brand can possess. It takes decades to build and can be destroyed in a single product cycle. Have you ever bought something not because you researched it, but because your parents had one and you never once saw them disappointed by it? That is the relationship Amana had built with an entire generation of American consumers by the early 1980s. It was not loyalty in the transactional sense. It was something quieter and more durable. It was the assumption of reliability, the expectation that the name on the front of the appliance was a promise that would be kept. The Amana of 1983 was a company at the absolute height of its powers, recognized nationally, trusted generationally, present in the majority of American homes, and still manufacturing from the same Iowa communities where George Forstner had started with a commercial freezer and a practical man's belief in honest work. It was, by any reasonable measure, a success story complete enough to end there. But success stories in American business rarely end at the top. And in the boardrooms of Raytheon's headquarters in Lexington, Massachusetts, decisions were already being made that the families standing in front of their Radaranges on a Wednesday evening in Akron and Tulsa and Sacramento had no way of knowing about, and no reason yet to worry about. The first shadows were forming, and they were forming quietly. The trouble with being first is that everyone who comes after you has the advantage of studying your mistakes. By the early 1980s, Amana had spent 15 years building the microwave oven market in the United States, educating consumers, overcoming skepticism, driving down prices, expanding distribution, and doing the slow, expensive work of turning a laboratory curiosity into a household necessity. It had done all of that brilliantly, and in doing so, it had built a road that every competitor in the world could now travel for free. The Japanese manufacturers arrived on that road with a particular kind of efficiency that American industry was still learning to take seriously. Sharp, Panasonic, and Sanyo had spent the 1970s watching the American microwave market develop, and they entered the 1980s with products that were lighter, cheaper to produce, and in several measurable categories, more consistent in their performance than what Amana was putting on shelves. The price differential was not marginal. A Sharp microwave in 1982 could retail for 30 to 40% less than a comparable Amana model. For a family making a considered appliance purchase, that gap was not easy to ignore. Amana's manufacturing costs were anchored in Iowa. The labor, the facilities, the supply chain, all of it reflected the cost structure of American domestic production, which had been a point of pride and was now becoming a structural disadvantage. Raytheon had not invested in the kind of manufacturing modernization that would have been required to close the cost gap with Japanese producers. The parent company's attention and capital were directed primarily toward its defense contracting business, which through the early 1980s was expanding rapidly under the Reagan administration's defense buildup. Amana was a profitable subsidiary, but it was not the priority, and companies that are not priorities do not get the investment they need to stay competitive. The second crack appeared not in the factory, but in the product line itself. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Amana had continued expanding its range of appliances, refrigerators, air conditioners, dishwashers, combination oven units, in the belief that a broader product line meant a stronger brand. The logic was understandable. The result was the opposite of what was intended. With resources spread across an expanding catalog, the engineering attention and quality control that had made the original Radarange exceptional began to thin. Products that carried the Amana name were no longer automatically the best version of what they were. Some were competitive, some were adequate, a few were neither. And in the appliance business, where a purchase is expected to last a decade, a single bad experience with one product is enough to break a customer's trust in the entire name. Consumer Reports, the publication that American appliance buyers had relied on for honest product evaluations since the 1930s, began to reflect the change. Through the 1970s, Amana refrigerators and microwave ovens had earned consistently strong ratings for reliability and performance. By the mid-1980s, the ratings were more varied, some models still performing well, others falling below the standards that had defined the brand's reputation. The readers of Consumer Reports were precisely the kind of careful, research-oriented buyers who formed the core of Amana's customer base. When the magazine's assessments shifted, the purchases followed. What was happening inside the company during these years? The engineers and line workers at the Amana plant were not oblivious. The people who built the products every day could feel the difference between a design that had been given time and resources and a design that had been value engineered to hit a price point. A senior engineer who had worked at the facility since the late 1960s described the shift in terms that were precise and uncomfortable. Components that had previously been specified at a certain tolerance being replaced with cheaper alternatives. Assembly processes that had been refined over years being accelerated to meet volume targets. Quality checks that had once been thorough becoming cursory under production pressure. He raised his concerns internally. He was told that the market required competitive pricing and that competitive pricing required cost discipline. He was not wrong to raise the concerns. The people who dismissed them were not wrong about the market pressure either. Both things were true. That is what made the situation so difficult to stop. How long can a brand live on its reputation after the product that built the reputation has begun to quietly decline? That question did not have an obvious answer in 1985. The Amana name still carried enormous weight with American consumers. The trust that had been built across 2 decades of reliable products did not evaporate with a single generation of compromised ones. People who had owned an Amana refrigerator for 15 years and found it still running perfectly had no particular reason to update their opinion of the brand based on what the newest models were doing. Brand loyalty, in its most powerful form, is essentially a form of memory. And memory is slow to revise itself in the face of evidence that contradicts what it already believes. But the evidence was accumulating, quietly in the way that structural problems always accumulate. Not in dramatic events that make the evening news, but in small individual disappointments that never get aggregated into a visible pattern until it is too late to address the root cause. A refrigerator that required a repair in its 3rd year instead of its 10th. A microwave that ran louder than the previous model. A dishwasher that cleaned less thoroughly than the competing brand sitting next to it on the showroom floor. No single failure was catastrophic. Together, they were erosion. The customers who noticed did not write letters to Amana's headquarters in Iowa. They did what disappointed consumers have always done. They told their neighbors. They told their coworkers. They mentioned it to their adult children who were furnishing their first homes and asking what brand to buy. And the answer that had once come without hesitation, Amana, without question, that's what we've always had, began in some households to carry a pause before it arrived. Raytheon's leadership in Lexington was watching the numbers. Revenue from the Amana subsidiary was still positive. Market share was declining, but gradually enough to be explained away as competitive pressure rather than internal failure. The defense business was booming, and the attention of the company's most senior people was directed toward the contracts and programs that represented Raytheon's real future. Amana was managed. It was not led. And there is a difference between those two things that eventually shows up in the product, in the workforce, and in the name on the front of the appliance. By the late 1980s, the brand that had once meant the future was beginning to mean something more ordinary, not failed, not forgotten, just diminished. The kind of diminishment that is hard to point to on any particular day, but impossible to deny when you compare the company of 1975 with the company of 1990, and ask yourself what exactly had been lost in the space between those 2 years. The answer to that question was about to get more complicated, because in 1997, Raytheon made a decision that would take the Amana name entirely out of the hands of the people who had built it, and place it in the hands of someone who had no particular reason to care what it had once meant. In 1997, Raytheon sold Amana Refrigeration to the Goodman Manufacturing Company of Houston, Texas. Goodman was a successful business, one of the largest manufacturers of residential heating and air conditioning equipment in the United States. It understood metal fabrication. It understood distribution. It understood how to move product through wholesale channels at competitive prices. What it did not have, and did not particularly need for its core business, was any deep connection to the history of a refrigerator company in Iowa, or any strategic vision for what the Amana name could become. Goodman bought Amana because the assets made financial sense, not because the brand meant something to them. That distinction, unremarkable in a transaction document, was devastating in practice. For the workers at the Amana plant in Iowa, the sale to Goodman was the first moment when the future felt genuinely uncertain. Raytheon had been a distant parent, inattentive, underfunding, more interested in missiles than microwaves, but it was a large and stable company whose ownership of Amana had at least provided institutional continuity. Goodman was different. It was a company oriented entirely toward cost efficiency and volume production, and it looked at the Amana operation in Iowa through that lens exclusively. The result was predictable. Manufacturing processes were reviewed, costs were identified, supply chain relationships were renegotiated. The standard vocabulary of post-acquisition rationalization was applied to a company whose value had never been primarily about cost structure. It had been about what the people in that facility knew how to build and how long they had been building it. The Amana brand spent 4 years inside Goodman before the next transaction arrived. In 2001, Maytag Corporation acquired Amana from Goodman for $325 million. On the surface, this looked like a rescue. Maytag was a genuine appliance company with a genuine understanding of what appliance brands were worth and how they were built. It had its own deep history in American domestic life. The Maytag repairman, the most famously idle man in American advertising, had spent decades communicating a single message about reliability that was the envy of the industry. If any company understood what the Amana name could mean, surely it was Maytag. The reality was more complicated and more damaging than the optimistic reading suggested. Maytag did not acquire Amana to invest in it. It acquired Amana to use it, specifically to use it as the entry-level brand in a tiered portfolio strategy that placed Maytag itself in the mid-range and left the premium segment to other acquisitions. In that architecture, Amana's job was not to innovate or to reclaim the quality reputation it had built under George Forstner. Its job was to capture budget-conscious consumers who would not pay for a Maytag but needed a brand name they recognized. Amana was purchased for its name recognition, its engineering legacy, its manufacturing tradition, its 67 years of accumulated identity. These were not assets in Maytag's strategic calculation. They were irrelevant to the role Amana had been assigned. The product development budget for Amana under Maytag reflected that assignment. Investment in new engineering was minimal. The Radarange name, which had defined American microwave culture for 3 decades, was quietly retired from marketing materials. The name that had once been synonymous with the entire category was deemed too old, too associated with a previous era, insufficiently contemporary for the retail environment of the early 2000s. It was replaced with generic product naming that communicated nothing except price point. Nobody inside Maytag appears to have understood or cared that they were erasing the most recognizable appliance brand name in American history. Manufacturing began to shift. Production that had been based in Iowa moved incrementally toward facilities in Mexico and later toward contract manufacturers in Asia. Each move was justified on cost grounds that were individually defensible and collectively corrosive. The workers in Iowa who remained understood what the direction of travel meant. Layoffs came in phases, not a single dramatic closure, but a series of reductions that shrank the workforce steadily over several years, each one accompanied by the standard language about operational efficiency and market conditions. The people who lost those jobs had in many cases spent their entire working lives in that plant. Their parents had worked there. In some families, 3 generations had built their livelihoods on the same factory floor. That history did not appear in Maytag's acquisition analysis. It did not need to. Who was supposed to protect what Amana had built? That question does not have a clean answer, and the discomfort of that fact is part of what makes the story worth telling. Raytheon was a defense contractor that had owned an appliance company for 32 years without ever fully understanding what it owned. Goodman was a cost-focused manufacturer that bought a brand it had no framework for stewarding. Maytag was a strategic acquirer that assigned the brand a role incompatible with its history. None of these companies were villains in any simple sense. They were businesses making business decisions according to the logic of their own interests, and the Amana brand was an asset that each of them used according to what they needed from it. The fact that what they needed from it, in each case, was less than what it was, that is not a crime. It is just a loss. The loss accelerated dramatically in 2006 when Whirlpool Corporation completed its acquisition of Maytag for $1.7 billion. Whirlpool was the largest appliance manufacturer in the world, and it was acquiring Maytag primarily for the Maytag brand itself and for manufacturing capacity. The other brands in Maytag's portfolio, Amana among them, were secondary considerations. Whirlpool already had its own brand hierarchy. Whirlpool in the mid-range, KitchenAid in the premium segment, Roper at the entry level. Amana fit awkwardly into that architecture, and the decision about where to place it was made quickly and without sentimentality. Amana became Whirlpool's value tier brand, the name attached to the least expensive products in the catalog, the appliances designed for customers whose primary criterion was price. The engineering team that had existed under Amana's own identity was dissolved into Whirlpool's consolidated product development structure. The marketing department that had carried the Amana brand identity was absorbed or eliminated. The distinct voice that the company had maintained, grounded, Midwestern, practical, earned, was replaced by the standardized brand language of a global appliance conglomerate managing a portfolio of names rather than a collection of identities. Amana was now one of 6 brands on a spreadsheet, positioned at the bottom of a price ladder, distinguished from the others primarily by what it cost rather than what it represented. The workers who remained in Iowa after the Whirlpool integration were working for a company that viewed their location as a legacy cost rather than a source of value. Production continued to migrate. The communities around the Amana colonies, in the same communities that had given the company its name, its founding philosophy, its century of accumulated craft knowledge, watched the factory presence diminish year by year, with the particular helplessness of people who understand exactly what is happening and have no mechanism to stop it. There is a specific kind of corporate death that leaves no single moment to point to, no bankruptcy filing, no closing announcement, no final day when the lights went out and everyone went home. It is the death by dilution, the gradual replacement of everything that made a thing itself with something cheaper, more generic, more easily managed, and less worth caring about. Amana did not die on a particular date. It was replaced incrementally by a version of itself that shared its name and nothing else. And the people who had trusted that name, who had bought it for their first apartments, received it as a wedding gift, recommended it to their children, were left with a brand that looked familiar from a distance and meant nothing up close. The name Amana is still on appliances today. It is still on shelves at Lowe's and Home Depot. It is still on refrigerators and microwave ovens and dishwashers that function adequately and cost less than comparable products from other brands. None of that is the point. The point is what the name used to mean before the decisions described in this chapter were made, and what it costs in ways that no balance sheet records when a name that once carried the weight of genuine achievement is reduced to a price signal. George Forstner built his first commercial freezer in Middle Amana in 1934 because he believed that useful things deserved to be made well by people who understood why quality mattered. In a community that had held craftsmanship as a core value for 100 years before he arrived. None of the executives who made decisions about the Amana brand between 1997 and 2006 were in that room in 1934. But the people who bought Amana appliances in 1972 and 1979 and 1983 were buying something that still carried that room's influence. And the people who buy an Amana appliance today are buying something that does not. That is the dark side of this story. Not a scandal, not a fraud, just the slow, entirely legal, entirely ordinary process by which something worth preserving was taken apart for the value of its components. And the components turned out to be worth considerably less than the whole. There was no single morning when Americans woke up and learned that Amana was gone. There was no front-page headline, no breaking news segment, no moment of collective recognition that something important had ended. The collapse of Amana was not an event. It was a condition, a state that the brand moved into gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way a house settles into its foundation over decades until one day a door no longer closes the way it used to, and you realize the shift has been happening for years without your noticing. But conditions have turning points, even when those turning points are invisible in the moment they occur. And for Amana, the period between 2004 and 2010 contains several of them. Moments when the distance between what the brand had been and what it was becoming crossed a threshold that could not be walked back across. Understanding those moments requires starting not with the corporate decisions that produce them, but with the people who live through them on the ground, in the plant, in the showroom, in the kitchen. In 2004, Maytag announced a series of production consolidations that resulted in significant layoffs at the Amana manufacturing facility in Iowa. The announcement was made in the language that corporate restructurings are always made in: operational efficiency, competitive positioning, market realities, the regrettable necessity of difficult decisions. The workers who received the news translated it into a different language, the one that people use when the institution that has organized their working lives for 20 or 30 years tells them it no longer needs them. Some had fathers who had worked at the same plant. Some had started on the floor straight out of high school and never left because they never needed to. The work was steady, the pay was fair, the product was something you could point to with pride. That version of the Amana job ended in 2004 for a significant number of the people who had held it. The community around the Amana colonies absorbed the blow in the way that small Midwestern communities absorb these blows. Quietly, practically, with the particular stoicism of people who have learned not to expect that the larger economic forces governing their lives will be arranged with their interests in mind. Local businesses that had depended on the plant's workforce felt the contraction. The tax base shifted. The conversations at the diner and the hardware store carried a new undercurrent. Not panic, but a sober recognition that the thing that had made this place economically viable for 70 years was in the process of leaving. Inside the retail environment, the change was registering differently. Appliance salespeople at the major chains, Sears, Best Buy, the independent dealers who had carried Amana since the 1970s, were having conversations with customers that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Customers who came in asking for Amana by name were being steered toward other brands by salespeople who had looked at the reliability data and drawn their own conclusions. In the appliance business, the floor salesperson is the last line of communication between a brand and a consumer. And when floor salespeople stop recommending a brand, the brand has lost something it cannot recover through advertising. The advertising can reach the customer before they enter the store. It cannot follow them inside. Consumer Reports published assessments through the mid-2000s that told a consistent story. Amana products range from adequate to below average across most categories, with reliability scores that place the brand in the lower half of nearly every segment it competed in. For a brand whose entire identity had been built on the promise of durability and honest value, those assessments were not just commercially damaging. They were a fundamental contradiction of everything the name had ever stood for. The readers who encountered those ratings and then looked up at the Amana logo in the showroom were experiencing, whether they articulated it this way or not, a form of broken promise. The microwave oven category told the starkest version of the story. Amana had created that category. The Radarange had been the product that defined American microwave culture for 15 years. The name so dominant that it had briefly become the generic term for the appliance itself. By the mid-2000s, Amana's microwave ovens were indistinguishable in design, performance, and price from the budget offerings of a dozen competing brands. The Radarange name was gone. The technology leadership was gone. What remained was a label attached to a product that competed on price in a commodity market, which is precisely the position that George Forstner had spent his career trying to avoid occupying. The Whirlpool acquisition in 2006 formalized what had been happening informally for years. When the largest appliance company in the world absorbs a brand and assigns it to the value tier of its portfolio, it is making a permanent statement about what that brand is worth and what role it will play going forward. There is no mechanism within that structure for the brand to recover its former identity. The identity has been deliberately replaced with a different one, and the resources that would be required to restore it will never be allocated because the new identity, however diminished, is serving the portfolio function it was assigned. Amana was now a price signal. It would remain a price signal. The question of what it had once been was not relevant to that function. For the consumers who had grown up with Amana, who had stood in front of a Radarange as children, watching their mothers heat soup in 30 seconds and feeling that particular 1970s certainty that the future was going to be wonderful, the encounter with the post-Whirlpool Amana was a specific kind of disappointment. Not the sharp disappointment of betrayal, but the dull disappointment of diminishment. The name was still there. The logo was recognizable. But the thing behind the name had changed in ways that were immediately perceptible to anyone who had known the original and was now meeting its replacement. A woman in Des Moines, her father had spent 22 years on the Amana factory floor, retiring in 1991 with the kind of pride in his work that comes from building something that lasts, walked into a Home Depot in 2008 looking for a new refrigerator. She saw the Amana logo. She felt the pull of it, the association, the memory, the instinct toward the familiar. She opened the door of the display model, ran her hand along the interior, checked the drawer mechanisms, looked at the seal on the door. Then she pulled out her phone and looked up the Consumer Reports rating. She bought a different brand. On the way to her car, she called her father to tell him she had been in the appliance section and seen the Amana name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was glad she had not bought it. He did not want her to be disappointed. That exchange, between a daughter who remembered what the name meant and a father who had helped make it mean something, is not recorded in any corporate document. It does not appear in any market research report or brand equity assessment, but it is the real measure of what Amana lost between 1997 and 2008. And it is the kind of loss that accounting systems are not designed to capture because it lives in people rather than in ledgers. The Amana plant in Iowa continued to operate in reduced form through the 2000s and into the 2010s, a diminished presence in the community that had given the brand its name. The Amana colonies, the 7 historic villages that had been the moral and geographic origin of everything George Forstner built, became increasingly defined by their tourism identity rather than their manufacturing one. Visitors came to see the historic architecture, buy the locally made furniture and wine and woolens, and eat in the German-style restaurants that had served the community for generations. The connection between the place called Amana and the appliances called Amana had become, for most visitors, a historical curiosity rather than a living relationship. The last thing to go was the assumption. For years after the quality had declined and the ownership had changed and the manufacturing had migrated, the Amana name still carried a residual assumption of reliability among consumers, old enough to remember what it had once earned. That assumption was the brand's final asset, more durable than the products, more persistent than the advertising, more resistant to erosion than anything else the company had possessed. It was the memory of trustworthiness, held in the minds of people who had once had reason to trust. It could not be renewed because the products that would have renewed it were not being made. It could only be spent. And by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, it had been spent almost entirely. Amana still exists. That fact is both true and beside the point. The brand that Percy Spencer's accidental discovery made possible that George Forstner's practical vision brought to life, that 3 million American families welcomed into their kitchens in the belief that it represented the best that American manufacturing could offer, that brand is gone. What remains shares its name. Nothing else. In the years after the Whirlpool acquisition reshaped what remained of Amana's identity, the American appliance market continued moving in exactly the direction that had made Amana's position untenable. LG and Samsung, the South Korean manufacturers that had spent the 1990s building quality reputations in electronics, arrived in the American appliance market in the early 2000s with products that combined genuine technological innovation with competitive pricing and industrial design that made American brands look like they had stopped paying attention. They had not simply undercut the market on price the way the Japanese manufacturers had done in the 1980s. They had outdesigned it, out-engineered it, and out-marketed it simultaneously. The consumers who might once have defaulted to an American brand name out of habit found themselves standing in a showroom looking at a Samsung refrigerator with a touchscreen interface and an Amana refrigerator with a price sticker and making the obvious choice. The microwave oven category, the one that Amana had built from nothing in 1967, completed its transformation into a pure commodity market sometime in the late 1990s. By 2005, a functional countertop microwave could be purchased at Walmart for under $50, a price point that represented a 90% reduction in real terms from the original Radarange. At that price, brand identity is irrelevant. The consumer is not buying a name. They are buying a box that heats food. The fact that the category had been created by a company with a name and a history and a community behind it was information that neither the buyer nor the seller needed in order to complete the transaction. The origin story had become invisible inside the commodity. What replaced Amana in the minds of American consumers was not a single competitor, but a reorganization of the entire category hierarchy. GE Appliances, eventually sold by General Electric to the Chinese company Haier in 2016, continued to occupy the mid-range. Whirlpool's own brand held its position. LG and Samsung claimed the premium and aspirational segments with the confidence of companies that understood how to make technology feel desirable rather than merely functional. The independent American appliance brand, the kind of company that Amana had been in its best years, rooted in a specific place, defined by a specific set of values, recognizable for what it stood for rather than where it sat on a price ladder, had essentially ceased to exist as a category. Not because the idea was wrong, but because the economic conditions that had allowed it to exist had changed beyond recovery. The Amana colonies in Iowa navigated the post-manufacturing era with the practical resilience that has always characterized the communities of the upper Midwest. The 7 villages that make up the historic settlement were designated a National Historic Landmark in 1965, and the tourism economy that developed around that designation provided an alternative economic foundation when the manufacturing presence contracted. Visitors come today to walk the brick streets, tour the communal kitchen museums, buy handmade furniture from the Amana Furniture Shop, and eat at restaurants that serve the same German-style food the colony founders brought from Europe in the 19th century. It is a genuine and living community, not a theme park. But the connection between the place and the appliance brand that carried its name has faded to the point where many visitors to the Amana colonies are unaware that the refrigerator in their kitchen and the historic village they are walking through share anything more than a coincidence of letters. The Radarange name, which had been the most recognized appliance brand in America for the better part of 2 decades, exists today primarily as a historical reference, mentioned in technology histories, cited in accounts of post-war American innovation, occasionally appearing in museum exhibits about the development of the microwave oven. The actual product name was retired from Amana's marketing materials in the early 2000s without announcement or ceremony. A name that had entered the American language, that had been used as a synonym for an entire appliance category. The way Xerox was used for photocopying and Band-Aid for adhesive bandages was simply discontinued. No farewell, no acknowledgement of what was being retired, just an absence where the name had been. The broader industry lesson that Amana's trajectory illuminates is one that American manufacturing has been learning and relearning since the 1970s, without ever fully absorbing it. Technological innovation creates categories. Creating a category generates a reputation. A reputation, if it is maintained through consistent product quality and genuine investment, becomes a brand. A brand in the appliance business can sustain a company through competitive pressure, economic downturns, and generational shifts in consumer taste, provided the company continues to deserve the trust the brand represents. The moment a company decides that the brand's reputation is a resource to be harvested rather than an asset to be maintained, the erosion begins. It begins slowly enough to be explained away. It accelerates faster than anyone predicts, and it cannot be reversed by the time it becomes impossible to deny. Amana harvested its reputation across 3 ownership transitions over 9 years. Raytheon had begun the process through neglect. Goodman accelerated it through indifference. Maytag institutionalized it through strategic reassignment. Whirlpool completed it through consolidation. No single owner made the decision to destroy what Amana had built. Each made a series of individually defensible decisions that collectively produced the destruction. That pattern, a distributed responsibility producing concentrated damage, is one of the defining features of American corporate history in the late 20th century, and Amana is one of its clearest illustrations. There were no meaningful revival attempts, no nostalgia relaunch, no limited edition radar range to mark the 50th anniversary of the product that changed American cooking. Whirlpool had no strategic incentive to invest in the heritage of a value-tier brand, and the consumers who would have responded to such an effort, the ones who remembered the original, who carried the association, were aging out of the primary appliance buying demographic with each passing year. The window for a meaningful revival, if it ever existed, had closed before anyone thought to open it. What does it mean when a brand disappears and nothing takes its place? Not a competitor, not a successor, but simply an absence where something familiar used to be? The question is not rhetorical in Amana's case. It points towards something real about what brands do in American life beyond their commercial function. They provide continuity. They give people a way of orienting themselves in the material world, of knowing that the thing they trusted last time will be available to trust again. When that continuity breaks, when the name persists but the trust it once represented does not, the loss is not just commercial. It is a small but genuine fracture in the texture of daily life, the kind that accumulates across hundreds of brands and dozens of years into something larger and harder to name. A sense that the things you relied on cannot be relied on, that the names on the products in your home are labels rather than promises. George Forstner never knew what would happen to the company he built. He died in 1997, the same year Raytheon sold Amana to Goodman, the first transaction in the sequence that would dismantle his legacy. Whether he understood in his final years what was coming is not recorded. What is recorded is what he built and why he built it, and how long it lasted before the people who owned it stopped understanding what they had. That understanding of what it means to build something with the intention that it will last, that it will be trusted, that it will carry the name of the place and the people who made it into the homes of strangers and be worthy of that trust, is what Amana represented at its best. It is also what the American manufacturing tradition represented at its best. The story of how that tradition was eroded, one acquisition at a time, one cost-cutting decision at a time, is not unique to Amana. But Amana tells it with particular clarity because the distance between what the company was in 1975 and what it became in 2006 is large enough to see plainly, and the reasons for that distance are specific enough to understand honestly. The lessons are there for anyone willing to look at them. Whether anyone is looking is a different question entirely. It is a kitchen in the mid-1970s. The floor is linoleum, worn smooth near the stove. The countertops are a shade of avocado green that was modern once and is simply familiar now. There is a window above the sink that looks out onto a backyard, a swing set, a garden that needs attention, a neighbor's fence. The refrigerator hums its low constant note in the corner, and on the counter between the toaster and the wall sits a machine unlike anything that kitchen had contained before. A large white box with a dark glass door and a dial timer and a small interior light that glows amber when the door is closed. On the front, in the clean brown lettering of the era, a single word: Amana. A child stands in front of it on a Wednesday evening, watching a bowl of soup rotate slowly behind the glass. The light inside makes the bowl look important, like something being examined rather than heated. 30 seconds. The timer ticks. The child has been told not to stand too close, though nobody has explained exactly why. And the warning has the quality of all warnings whose authority rests entirely on the certainty with which they are delivered. The machine makes a soft mechanical sound as the carousel turns. Then the bell, a single, clean, definitive ding, and the light goes off and the door opens, and the soup is hot and the world is ordinary again, except that it isn't, because something that was not possible this morning is possible now. And the child standing in front of that machine in that kitchen in that year knows it in the wordless way that children know things and will not forget it. That ding, that specific, unhurried, utterly confident sound. Anyone who grew up in an American home in the 1970s or 1980s carries it somewhere in the back of their memory, attached to evenings in kitchens and the particular comfort of food made ready without effort. It was the sound of the future arriving on schedule. It was the sound of a promise kept. It was, for a generation of Americans who heard it 10,000 times before they were old enough to think about what it represented, simply the sound of home. Amana did not just sell appliances. It sold a particular version of American confidence. The confidence that came from living in a country where a practical man in a small Iowa town could take a technology developed in a wartime laboratory and turn it into something that sat on a working family's kitchen counter and made their evenings easier. That transaction between the ingenuity of the maker and the trust of the buyer is the foundation of what American manufacturing meant at its best. It assumed that the people building the product cared whether it worked. It assumed that the name on the front meant something about what was inside. It assumed a relationship of mutual responsibility between the company and the customer that extended beyond the point of sale. That the product would perform, that it would last, that if you bought this name again, you would receive the same quality you received before. That assumption is not naive. It is not sentimental. It is the basic contract of commerce conducted with integrity, and it is the reason that certain brand names accumulate the kind of trust that takes decades to build. Amana had that trust. It earned it in the kitchens and living rooms and garages of ordinary American families who had no particular reason to think about brand management or corporate strategy or shareholder value, who simply knew that the appliance worked, had always worked, and would work the next time they needed it to. That trust was the real product. The refrigerators and the microwave ovens were the vehicles. The trust was what Amana was actually selling and what its customers were actually buying. Every time the name changed hands in a retail transaction across 30 years of American domestic life. When that trust was broken, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but through the gradual substitution of a cheaper and less committed version of the product for the one that had earned the name, something was lost that cannot be recovered by maintaining the trademark. A trademark is a legal instrument. Trust is a human one. They are not interchangeable. The Amana name still exists on appliances today, and those appliances are adequate, and they are affordable, and they do what appliances are supposed to do. But they do not carry the weight that the name once carried, because weight of that kind is not transferable. It has to be earned in the making, every time, by people who understand why it matters. And the people who understood why it mattered stopped being the ones making the decisions a long time ago. What is lost when a brand like Amana disappears, not from the shelf but from itself, is not easily quantified and not easily replaced. It is a certain kind of accountability. The accountability of a company that knows its customers by name, not by demographic. That builds its product in the same community where it was founded. That understands the connection between the quality of the work and the dignity of the worker, and the trust of the buyer as a single continuous thing rather than three separate variables to be optimized independently. That kind of accountability produced the Radarange. It produced the refrigerators that ran for 20 years in the basements of houses in Ohio and Minnesota and Texas. It produced the particular pride that a factory worker in Amana, Iowa felt when she told her father she was making the future, and meant it without irony. Somewhere tonight, an older man is explaining to his grandchild what it meant to see a radar range for the first time. He is trying to describe the specific quality of that experience, the combination of surprise and certainty, the feeling that something genuinely new had arrived, and that it had arrived from a place and a people he trusted. The grandchild will look it up later, will find the history, will understand in the abstract what the grandfather is describing. But the grandchild will not feel it. The feeling required being in that kitchen, in that decade, in that particular moment of American life when the distance between what was possible and what was ordinary was closing fast, and a company in Iowa was helping to close it. The Amana colonies are still there. The brick streets, the old communal kitchens, the woolen mill, the furniture shop, the restaurants that serve sauerbraten and apple strudel to visitors from across the country. The place endures. The people endure. The values that George Forstner carried out of those colonies in 1934, the belief in honest work, in durable things, in the integrity of the maker's name, those values did not disappear when the company was sold. They went back to where they came from. They are still in the land and in the community and in the memory of everyone who built something there and meant it. The name on the appliance is just a name now, but the name on the land is something else. It is the record of what was possible when the people making the thing and the people using the thing were connected by more than a transaction. When they were connected by trust, by place, by the shared understanding that quality is not a marketing position but a moral one. That understanding built the radar range. It built everything that followed. And it is worth remembering, not because it can be recovered, but because knowing what was lost is the only honest way to understand what we are missing.